साफ किया, साफ नजर तू आया, रब को मेहरबान पाया। आईना साफ किया, साफ नजर तू आया। ये मैं मेरा ही मुझको तुझसे दूर किए था, ये मैं मेरा ही मुझको तुझसे दूर किए था। जाने गुरूर था क्यों मुझको जो मगरूर किए था, जाने गुरूर था क्यों मुझको जो मगरूर किए था। निगाह पर्दा हटा, रब को निगहबां पाया, निगाह पर्दा हटा, रब को निगहबां पाया। आईना साफ किया, साफ नजर में आया। ये तेरी यादें तो रूबरू मिलाती है, ये तेरी यादें तो रूबरू मिलाती है। देखूं तुझे तो बड़ा रूह सुकून पाती है, देखूं तुझे तो बड़ा रूह सुकून पाती है। कभी न मैं तन्हा रब को रहनुमा पाया, कभी न मैं तन्हा रब को रहनुमा पाया। आईना साफ किया, साफ नजर तू आया। आईना साफ किया, साफ नजर में आया। जो मैं को साफ किया, साफ नजर तू आया, रब को मेहरबान पाया। आईना साफ किया, साफ नजर तू आया, रब को मेहरबान पाया, रब को निगहबां पाया, रब को रहनुमा पाया।
Om Shanti. Good morning. So warm welcome to Brother Charlie. I think everyone knows Brother Charlie. Is there anyone who doesn't know Brother Charlie? We all know Brother Charlie. One of the first double foreigners to emerge, sustained and nurtured by Daddy Janki for many, many years in London, and now the National Coordinator for Australia. But I think we all appreciate Charlie by his lightness, his very warm nature, and just that feeling of an elder brother that always very lovingly creates a very close feeling of family. And I think that's something we all appreciate from Charlie Bai. He's our big brother and our friend. So looking forward to this morning's topic. I think subtlety and the subtlety of the intellect is something we all are feeling is we need to develop further, particularly as we reach this point in the confluence age. And so looking forward to your exploration of that. Thank you.
Om Shanti. Good morning and welcome to everyone in the hall. There's not so many of us, but I'd also like to welcome all the Zoomers, those who are watching in different corners of the world, because we have a really wonderful team. Thanks to Dorothy, Pratibha and everybody who are not only arranging things for us here, but those who want to can watch in all corners of the world. So on behalf of all of you, I'm going to give them a wave and a welcome. So one thing I've really felt this time, and I wonder whether you are feeling it too, that since I came to this divine mountain where God incarnates, more than ever, and I must have been here close to, I don't know how many times, 80, 90 times, maybe more. The contrast of the atmosphere here and the atmosphere out there, how great is it? Do you notice? It's incredible, isn't it? It's really like we're on another planet here, I think. And it's just so light, so sweet. And yet we know that around the world so many of our brothers and sisters are, when I say that, the human family, are really suffering a lot, but we really have a lot of mercy and good wishes. You know, in my Brahman journey, I think I've learned that everything depends on the intellect. The intellect is that magic thing that when it opens up, it's like I enter a completely different perception of the self and life and everything. And all of us here and those of us online, when we walk into Baba's center or whenever we did the course, and we listen to Baba's introduction, it's the intellect that has a realization. It's the intellect that recognizes and understands. And almost as soon as the intellect recognizes Baba, recognizes God, I start this incredible journey of self-transformation. Because I realize that my intellect has lost all its power. My intellect has become gross. And now I really want to step back into that subtle intellect once again. And when we come into the Copper Age, once again the intellect, because the perception that I inherit is that I'm a temporary body. And it's like a veil comes over the intellect. I enter a false perception of absolutely everything. And because of that false perception, I enter into the experience of peacelessness and sorrow and unhappiness. You know, there's so many ways of looking at the cycle, but one of the ways is that as the intellect, the quality of the intellect really influences really the state of the soul. So everything really depends on the intellect. And one of the first things we learn in Brahman life is the anatomy of the soul. And something which I heard only recently has really sort of got me thinking and experiencing, not just thinking, but experiencing. Such a simple thing, but you know, the journey to soul consciousness, we're constantly learning and transforming that learning into a feeling. And someone was just telling me that this body is made, science believes, of 40 trillion cells. That's unimaginable, don't you think? 40 trillion little building blocks that make up this thing that you're seeing. And the human soul is more subtle than even one of those 40 trillion building blocks. Doesn't it sort of give you an incredible sort of insight into who I really am, the subtlety of the self? And Baba. Baba is also the most subtle being. And in a way, what quality of intellect do I need to really be able to not just know and believe, but to taste that subtle self and really have a relationship with another being so subtle? It's something which is incredible. But I've always loved the analogy of the soul, that I think of the theatre, and the mind is like a screen. You know, when the screen comes down here, there's a big screen. And I really love that all the data that I see, that I taste, that I hear, is thrown up on that screen. All the information of life at a particular moment. And the intellect is like you sitting in the theatre. You're observing all the data that comes onto the screen of your mind. And you then assess all that data. The intellect goes zzz, it's like instant. You assess that data, the personalities, the atmosphere, and then you decide something, you perform an action, you speak, you do something or you don't do something. And then that is recorded in my subconscious. In a way, my sanskaras are a record of all the decisions my intellect takes. I carry an entire sort of story of all my past decisions that I've been carrying in my subconscious. So this incredible sort of journey internally that constantly, at every millisecond, the mind is receiving information, the intellect is observing it, trying to make sense of it, and then responding. And it almost all happens absolutely instantly. How important then, what is that point of awareness that makes me make the right decisions or makes me make the wrong decision? It really depends on the quality of my intellect, the quality of my understanding. And you know, how many titles does Baba have? Thousands. You know, someone once gave me a beautiful picture in calligraphy, which is like of all the names of God for Muslims, for Islam. There was hundreds of them just for one religion. But one of Baba's really fascinating titles is the intellect of the wise. And Baba, this most subtle of subtle beings, you know, so subtle, has an intellect that eternally retains all truth, is never, ever adulterated, tainted, or influenced in any way. And then when you think this incredibly subtle being enters the body of Brahma at the end of the cycle, and this intellect that's never been tainted, every single one of us, from Brahma Baba down, all our intellects have been tainted, have been influenced, have been affected. Baba starts to share his intellect what is retained in his intellect, his perception of absolutely everything. And, I think we tend to think we always see reality. But as you know, we create our own reality. I mean, have you ever been with anyone and you see the same scene and how you see it and they see it is like a million miles apart? Who's had that experience? I think everyone. I've been in a meeting and, with people, and I've come out and said, what a great meeting. And the other person said, that was the worst meeting I've ever been to, Because we all have our own perception of reality, even though we make this assumption the way I see reality is really right. And I remember my sister-in-law telling me once that she and my brother, they had a lot of friends, and they used to go to a lot of dinner parties. And when they would drive home after an evening of meeting their friends and so on, my sister-in-law always used to like to debrief on what happened around the dinner table. And she said to me sometimes, my perception of what happened and compared to my brother's was so different. She used to say to my brother's name was Richard, Richard, did we go to the same dinner party? He saw it in such a different way, completely and utterly different. And this is the wonder of the intellect at the end of the cycle, that it's constructed from so many flavors of, our mood and our emotions and our sanskaras and our past history and our karmic accounts, and then all the external factors that are sort of swirling around and constantly influencing how I'm seeing everything around me. And how do I really know the quality of my intellect? If this life is really the life to attain a divine intellect, a subtle intellect, to really attain an intellect that's like the same window as Baba's, so I start to see and interpret life like Baba, how can I tell, how I'm going? And for me, Baba often gives the labels, doesn't he? The tamo pradhan, the tamo, the rajo, the sato pradhan. He often refers to that in terms of the quality of the intellect. And I feel my reactions to people really reveal where my intellect is at in this spiritual journey. And if I reject somebody, I remember Daddy Janki once said that the most tamo pradhan of all sanskaras is to reject another. If I hold a grudge, or if I don't speak to somebody, I just absolutely ignore them, or I can't forgive somebody, I would say it's a little thing that's showing me that I still have remnants of that tamo pradhan nature of my intellect. It's not about the other person. The other person's an instrument to reveal to me who I am. Yes, their behavior might be like this. Yes, their behavior might be like that. But my reaction to that behavior is revealing to me the influences on my intellect. And if I reject, hold grudges, then maybe I'm still carrying a bit of that tamo pradhan nature. A tamo intellect, I would say, is an intellect that's constantly critical, is always finding fault. I might not say much, I may even have a little smile on my face, but the intellect is always finding fault. Or an intellect that's so easily upset. A little tiny baby thing happens and I make it into such a big deal, I get so upset and disturbed. A rajo intellect is really about preferences. I like you, but I prefer you. I like it done this way, I don't like it done that way. So I'm really into my preferences. A sato intellect, when the intellect starts to become sato, that's really when I see virtue in others. I have good wishes and pure feelings for others. I can give respect, I can give love. excuse me, I can have mercy for others around me. And a Sato-Pradhan intellect is really an intellect like the intellect of the wise. And that's an intellect that even if others put me down, even if others defame me, that it doesn't affect me. A bit like Shiv Baba, sometimes he says, no one's been defamed, in the cycle more than me. So it's not about other people. It's about observing my reactions to people is probably a bit of an indicator of where have I come from a gross intellect to a subtle intellect. And if I'm still sometimes rejecting, getting easily upset, etc., still telling me I have remnants of the old and I haven't really traveled to the new. But the intellect is really a fascinating part of the anatomy. And when you think of this incredibly subtle soul, to me the intellect is a number of things, and Baba uses different language for it. It is a vessel, a container. And I like to think of it like that in a sense. It's a container where I hold the understanding of who I am, what is reality, what is really happening around me. In a sense, it's a container that holds my sense of self, my sense of reality. And at the beginning of the cycle, my sense of self, I knew I was a soul. It was a natural thing. And my reality was that I will die and take rebirth. It's an absolutely natural process. I have no fear of that process. But when I come further down the cycle, by the end of the cycle, what happens? That my sense of self is so tarnished that my intellect looks down on myself. Often I will feel a victim. I'm convinced it's reality. I am a victim, but actually it's because my intellect has been tainted. That's how I feel. And we all know that the ultimate state of when the intellect does become Tamo-Pradhan, all my self-value is lost. And even as we know as Brahmins, this journey to genuinely step back into self-value, which is really stepping back into a subtle intellect, it really does take time. And so I would say that, the intellect is like a vessel. And what we are really doing is removing the container full of the knowledge that when I walk in Baba's door, and beginning to replace it with God's truth in that container. So even Baba uses the language, doesn't it, that it needs a golden vessel to hold the lioness's milk. It needs a really divine intellect to really hold God's truth. And in a sense, our whole journey to a subtle intellect is removing the old story, the old perception I've been holding, and really starting to look through the window of Baba's perception. And so that's really the first thing I would say. The intellect is like a vessel that is holding my understanding of who I am and my understanding of life. And really what I'm doing is removing the old understanding and trying to fill in that vessel, God's understanding. The second thing I often feel, and more recently I've been feeling, is that the intellect is like a traveller. Who's a traveller at heart here? Oh, not that many. I'm surprised. I thought Brahmins were the great travellers. Because, what I've observed is the intellect is beyond time and space. In this incredibly subtle soul, the intellect, just sort of visualize you're sitting here, but your intellect in a split second faster than time travels back in time or travels an infinite distance. Your intellect can travel to the person beside you or back to your country in the same time. And it's an incredible process at this traveling intellect. Why? Because it's searching, it's seeking, something is lost. I honestly believe the hardest thing in meditation, when we sit to meditate, what happens? The intellect travels outside. Does that happen? Does it happen? I think it happens. Is there anyone it doesn't happen to? So you sit down and your aim is to remember Baba, and you travel back to your center. You travel to a personality, you travel to something. And each time you do, what I'm observing is in an instant you connect with wherever you travel to, the person, the memory, a place, something you have to do. The instant you connect, you are influenced by that connection. And whatever influences you, you have a feeling or an experience inside. And so this intellect, sometimes it's like I sort of visualize, it's plugging in. It plugs in there, it plugs in there, it plugs in there, it plugs in there. It's on this constant search, plugging in. And whatever I plug into, I'm influenced by. So to become subtle, Baba says, children, remember me alone. When the subtle thread goes beyond the material world, beyond bodily beings, and I connect with the being who's as subtle as me, Baba, I'm influenced by Baba, his virtues, his state. And it's like I download Baba into me and that feeling inside of me. But when my intellect travels to people, and this has been our habit for half a cycle, and really I've been observing, it's so profoundly deep. Whether I'm attracted or not attracted, we keep traveling to people. And sometimes we even dwell on a certain person because of their behavior. It's almost like my intellect is a magnet that gets stuck. I can't pull it back. I don't have the power of knowledge. I dwell on it, and it's almost like I put myself under the karmic influence of others in this sense. And what happens is that, I feel really empty and flat. And if even the intellect travels to the self, my past, my weaknesses, my mistakes, lowest vibration, why does Baba say, children, remember me alone? Really in a sense that when the intellect travels, and it will travel, when it tastes the love of God, then it's really attracted to that destination. And in a sense, this is the journey, isn't it? When the intellect travels to a person, what I'm starting to feel that this effort is really paying attention, just attention. Where does my intellect travel to in that split second? And I've been sharing, sometimes I wake up for Amrit Vela, I'm sure you must do this sometimes, and I have such a deep thought that I'm going to really remember one Baba. And then in 1.2 seconds, you've traveled somewhere. Who's had that experience? It's not even to a bad place. And this is the incredible nature of the subtle intellect. And this is where this life is, effort to me is just, it's not about being tense, but just observing where the intellect travels to and gently keep taking it back to one, taking it back to one, taking it back to one. Because really, when the intellect gets caught in these old stories, in these old things, then, I come under those influences and then I don't feel happy. Really, for me, I really feel these days that if I'm not feeling that good, if I'm not feeling happy, there's only one question to ask myself. What have I been remembering? What have I plugged my intellect to? Where have I traveled and put myself under the influence? So the intellect is a vessel that holds God's truth. It's a traveler that's always searching, seeking, and plugging in, because ultimately it's been looking for truth and love and purity and power, the destination. But thirdly, the intellect is like a lens, which is the sort of the filter that I understand and perceive everything around me. You know, it's like I wear, in the golden age, it's like I don't wear glasses, you know? I see reality. When I come to the copper age, I start to wear slightly tinted glasses. You know how some people have slightly tinted glasses? So my vision, my perception of people, myself, what's going on, is slightly affected because my intellect has become body conscious. So it's slightly affected by my ego, by my dependence, by my attraction to name and form. But when I get to the Iron Age, it's almost like I'm wearing dark glasses, you know? My vision is 100% distorted. It is so deeply distorted because I have adopted the dark glasses that I'm a temporary body and I'm all the labels and the ramifications, the sort of the cascading effect of that falsehood, that I really, this subtle soul, smaller than a cell, now identifies with this huge and gross thing. It cascades into how I feel, my relationships, absolutely each and every bit of my life. And we know that when this begins to happen, I compare myself with others. I feel inferior. There's a whole lot of things. I start to chase after superficial things in life for temporary highs, you know? I do things, I eat things, I have relationships, I have friendships, and I get these temporary highs. And I become even addicted to those temporary highs. We all know the sort of the dark sunglasses, where the intellect is completely distorted. My perception, my judgments, my understanding of most things is really not accurate at all. And so the intellect is like a lens that I'm observing reality through. And there's 4 lenses that I think we can look through. And the first one is really like the gross lens, like I was saying, the lens when I think I'm a body. And this lens is driven, this intellect, this perception is driven by my desires and my karmic story. It's almost like the poor intellect has become so weak that my whole sort of perception of everything is just driven by my desires and, you know, my karmic story. And how does this influence my Brahman life? Because we're here because we want to go return to that divine and subtle intellect. We're on the journey. We're all on the journey. But I feel the remnants of that gross intellect, even though I am a Brahman and practicing, still sit with me. And so hence when I'm wearing the dark sunglasses of this sort of gross intellect, you know, I'm so delicate, I'm so sensitive. If I'm still really delicate and sensitive, the little tiny things disturb me and upset me, know my intellect is still sort of, you know, wearing the dark sunglasses, still in this sort of gross perception of things. And even sometimes I think our attitude to service, because in the Lokik world, we kept doing things to get a temporary high. You know how life, you go out, you have a bit of fun, you get high and you come back again. It's just this constant, this is what addiction really is. Even I think we use service to get a quick fix, a quick high, you know. I get a bit of praise, I get a bit of success, I get a bit of something. And that's why some of us, really service becomes such a big thing for us, because still the intellect has some of this gross quality, and I keep wanting these temporary hits to feel better about myself. And so this is, you know, the oldest lens, or the more recent lens perhaps, is this gross perception when I really think I'm just a temporary body and all the labels of the body. And then this very gross perception, and this is an intellect full of sorrow. And an intellect full of sorrow, what does Baba call them? A stone intellect, doesn't he? You know? A stone intellect can't absorb anything. A stone intellect it's had so much sorrow, it sort of just can't absorb any truth much. Or sometimes Baba calls a baby intellect. Have you heard Baba call a baby intellect? They're the intellects that are so delicate, so sensitive. You know, Brahma Baba wasn't very merciful on children who were too delicate. He would say feeling is like a flu and, we should grow up. Or sometimes Baba calls a buffalo intellect. Have you heard him call a buffalo intellect? Which is a very stubborn intellect. That intellect, I'm right. I'm right. The way I see life is right. That's to me the ultimate state of ego, of intellect. My intellect is so under the influence of my ego. The way I see things, the way I do things is the right way. So the first lens is this sort of gross lens, you can say, when the intellect is in that gross state. The second, I would say, is a creative lens. And I really believe that a lot of us on our journey to find truth, we were the ones every lifetime, the ones who woke up first, went to ring the bells in the temples, and, we've tried so hard to find truth. And yet sometimes all the rituals and all the things, really became boring, incredibly boring. And so the arts became a way of expressing our spirituality which is a really lovely thing to do. So that creative intellect is the intellect of a musician, an artist, even a scientist. The gross intellect just is only the reality as the external world. The creative intellect is thinking. It's still in the material world, but it's creating music, it's creating art, it's creating here, which is a lovely thing in a way. But sometimes I think, how does this influence my Brahman life? I think sometimes, when we're new, how enthusiastic are we? We're the first one in Amrit Vela, we're the first one in the Murli, we do everything. But after a while, you know how you start off, you're just running, you're sprinting, and then you start to jog a bit. Then what happens? You start to walk, then you start to saunter, and oh yeah, I've heard that before, oh yeah, I know this. Boredom can set in. Boredom can set in a big way. Boredom is a really, I would say, gross state of body consciousness too. And so sometimes, even within Brahman life, when we get bored with doing our own work of going deep into knowledge and experimenting in yoga, we start to look to the arts in a way to get our newness in Brahman life. In a way, a creative intellect is an intellect that always wants newness. Newness is good, but sometimes we just want external newness, entertainment and this sort of thing. The third lens that I think is sort of our intellects have been carrying, there's the gross lens, the creative one, is the devotional lens. And that's a really fascinating one, because that lens is really, we've been searching. And for so many lifetimes, we've been searching for truth, searching for meaning. And when we went into the churches, into the mosques, into the temples, into wherever we went, there's usually, not in all of them, but in most of them, a bodily being there. There's Krishna, there's Christ, there's Ganesh or Hanuman or whoever, a saint, a sage, a guru. And in a sense, this devotional intellect is so sincere, and yet it's driven by name and form. Name and form. And how does this devotional part of my intellect affect even Brahman life? Even within the Brahman family, Shiv Baba says, remember me alone. I, that subtle, subtle, subtle being, remember that subtle, subtle, subtle Supreme Being. And yet, Brahma Baba and the daddies, what great souls they are. But often even Brahma Baba, when he was alive, he didn't like photos taken of him because he knew that this life, for the subtle intellect to really grow, we have to go beyond all name and form. And yet, even within our Brahmin family, sometimes we sort of see a special teacher or a special instrument, and we get a little bit impressed by them. One of the murlis which I've really loved, and I keep in my box of special murlis, I've lost my box recently, was when Baba was talking about purity. And Baba was really saying that, the reason we get defeated in purity is that when we get impressed by someone's virtues, someone's personality, someone's teaching, they're a great teacher, someone gives me love, all this sort of thing. And Baba was then quoting us, I really like this person, they're such a great teacher, they give me love, they give me support. And then you think, what's wrong with that? But you know what Baba went on to say? What happens is we subtly put this individual who has a name and form, a bodily being, which is the addiction of my intellect for half a cycle, on a pedestal. And Baba said, subtly, Shiv Baba moves out of the picture, and that individual is in front of me. And sometimes I think even we bring this sanskara from, our bhakti days into the Brahman family, because we can see people and we can hear them, and yet really my experience is that what I learned from the life of Brahma Baba was that he was really remembering Shiv Baba, and ultimately we can learn from each other, we can appreciate each other, but the real Raj Yogi is the one that develops such a subtle intellect. I can remember Shiv Baba and feel love and feeling from Shiv Baba. And the more my intellect is still under the influence of name and form, bodily beings, even images, however virtuous they are. Because when people do remember Krishna and Christ, they get something. They do get something, but it's temporary. And Baba's taking us to the highest quality of intellect, the intellect that can really connect with the being that's beyond all images, so to speak, just the image of the soul. And I think it's a really, really subtle thing in the journey that, this is an amazing Brahmin family. My experience is just incredible, the quality of people. To live in this family, appreciate them, see their virtues, but not be impressed. That is real purity, actually. And that's why Baba said the reason we get defeated in purity is when we put someone on a pedestal, whoever that may be, whoever that senior may be. We respect them, but we don't get impressed. That's the devotional intellect. The devotional intellect is driven by name and form and getting impressed. And that's really not a subtle intellect still. Because the divine intellect, I would say the subtle intellect, is the intellect that's really driven by three things. One, all relationships with that most subtle of all being, the intellect of what the wise. The more I go forth in my Brahman life, this is probably the most crucial point for the soul to really move forward, to have all relationships. And often I think this traveling intellect, we go to Shiv Baba, and I get that subtle power. I come under God's influence. And then in a millisecond, I go to a human being, and I'm slightly irritated. And it's almost like the power then drains out. Then I go back to Baba. Then I go to another person. I'm slightly impressed. And then sometimes we think, hey, Baba, I'm a Brahman, and yet I'm not really feeling that I'm moving forward. I'm really progressing as I really should. And this, sometimes I think that all relationships with one, we asked Daddy Prakashmani why she became the instrument of the yajna. And she said, because she's had this sanskara right from the beginning. And to me, this is the first prerequisite for an intellect that becomes like the one that's the intellect of the wise. It becomes so subtle, so clean. The second thing that a divine intellect, a subtle intellect is driven by is Srimat. I never see Srimat as rules and regulations. To me, Srimat is not rules and regulations. Srimat is like a deep code of truth. A deep code of truth that if I follow, it will give me the gift of the subtle intellect back. And one way I look at Srimat these days is that from the beginning of the Copper Age, I put myself under hundreds of influences, of gurus, of teachers, of saints, of sages, of cultures, of society, what they expect, of parents, of so many things, And all these things have polluted my intellect. And all of them have influenced, excuse me, my perception of everything happening around me. What does it mean to follow Srimat? It means to put myself under the influence of one and one alone. It's absolutely the passage to a more subtle intellect. So if I remember one and I really realize I listen to everybody, their views, but ultimately I listen, to God and what God says, because that's the intellect that's never been tainted. And that's when I really value every direction from Baba. It heals this sort of gross intellect, this creative intellect, this devotional intellect. It really heals that so that I can have the subtlety of intellect like Baba. Sometimes I think a subtle intellect can, when they even meet another human soul, can tune into them, can absolutely tune into them, And that's really what Buddhi Yoga is, the yoga of the intellect, which we have with Baba. But when I have that such a subtle connection, I come in front of a soul and I can know where they're at and how to respond to them. I can read them. That's the basis of successful relationships, such a subtle intellect. It's like the ultimate emotional intelligence. I can just read this person. That's what Baba does for us, because his intellect is so subtle. And I can read through their face, through their vibrations, through everything, what's going on and how to respond to them in a way that's perhaps uplifting and supportive in that way. So this divine intellect, this subtle intellect, is driven by all relationships with one, God's directions. And I would say that really my intellect, that vessel, holds all of Baba's truth, not part, not half of what Baba's telling me and half what I think. Am I still driven by my own thinking, or have I surrendered that much that I really realize that Baba's a superior thinker to me? That's what really surrender is. But when I really do that, the clarity of my intellect, the clarity of my perception, the awareness of what to do at the right time, it helps me. It's like you develop an intellect that knows how to navigate this iron-aged, really challenging world we're all dealing with. And even when we come in front of all these variety of personalities, because of the subtlety that Baba's given me, I can see where they're at, what's going on, and how to respond. I remember Baba talking about this, that you become successful in relationships. How important is that in Brahman life, to be able to really know how to respond to all the different varieties of personalities. If I respond in the same way to everyone, it's not going to work very well. So the intellect is many things, isn't it? It's firstly the vessel. Secondly, the traveller that's always travelling and plugging in. And, thirdly, the lens. The lens and the different types of lenses. But the fourth thing, which Baba and we often talk about, the intellect is the decision maker. And how important, in a way, where I arrive in life, what I'm experiencing in life, my happiness or my lack of happiness is all based on my decisions of the past. And what is that? That's my intellect. And when I think of it, when that mind that's like a screen, and all the data, it goes up on the mind, and instantly there's data, there's a certain personality, they may be not so happy, there's a situation going on, there's something I have to do, all this data is there. I'm presented, my intellect is presented with the external data from the external world. But equally, my intellect is presented with my internal data, which is like my memory, which is like my mood, which is like my emotions. And almost I have 1/1000th of a second to really assess the external data, assess the internal data, and decide. And yet I would say that 1/1000th of a second is the most crucial part of my Brahman life. Because what I do is creating my destiny in a sense. How I behave, how I respond is in a sense creating my future. So how important is that instant moment that I receive all the data from life, I assess it, and then I decide. And that's why when I've really created a subtle intellect, a divine intellect that's really only influenced mainly by Shiv Baba, it's got the sort of the parameters of Srimad, and it's holding God's truth. Then it's almost like I have this very subtle way of assessing the data and responding to the data. One of the things I really loved from Daddy Janki, and I've really tried to do it more, I'm a little bit impulsive. I like to do things straight away. Who asked Daddy something and she said, wait and see? Who's had that experience? I've heard it so many times. I can't tell you, I've adopted that. And you sort of think I need to jump in and do something to resolve something, clear something, improve something. And sometimes you need to do that. But sometimes when you wait and see, it heals itself, it resolves itself, and a great outcome comes. I've really been amazed. And so it's almost like when my intellect is pulled out of the body conscious, the gross world, and it's more under Baba's influence and his directions, I start to have a quality of decision making which is really going to create a very, very positive future for myself. And when I really think of this, the intellect, and to me, in a sense, it's the intellect that remembers God. And that's why the whole of this life, a life of purity, a life of study, is to strengthen my intellect, to connect with God and stay with God. And to practice that even, not just when I sit to meditate, but as I move about, I pay attention to keep that subtle thread under the influence of one. So when I'm presented with these instant situations, these instant reactions from people, things that happen, I'm in a place, my intellect is prepared, it's subtle, and it can be more influenced by how Baba would respond to something than rather my old self and my old emotions. Of course, sometimes my old emotions kick in, I respond inappropriately. That will happen. But as long as I learn from it, because I've been, my experience of the last 2 years really has been around living in this world at this time in the last few years of the cycle, and really the whole of this study is to keep my intellect with one. We absorb the ocean of knowledge to keep the intellect accurately connected with the one who's ever pure and ever true. That's our study, fundamentally. And so in a way, incrementally, I have to keep building my intellect, strengthening my intellect. And that's where we do that when we remember Baba. But as soon as I plug into an old memory, an old hurt, an old whatever it is, it's almost like I fill with power, I drain with power. I fill with power, I drain with power. I drain of power, and then I wonder why I'm not feeling that strong anymore. And I think that really years of following Baba's principles, years of remembering Baba, the intellect just gets so subtle to the point that in the golden age, I honestly feel we don't speak much. I think a lot of it is done telepathically. The intellect is so pure, so clean, so subtle, I can understand you without really, needing to speak. But nowadays, what do? We sit down somewhere. That's why coffee shops have been invented, so people spend 5 hours unloading all their feelings. But once I remember we had silence in a center when I was very new in Gyan, and for 3 or 4 days. And I can tell you, there was one brother I was staying with. I was picking up everything. He said, in the end, he didn't need to speak because I could pick up his thoughts, what he wanted. And I really do feel that that's the subtlety of our intellect. So when we communicate in the Golden Age, it's not so much gross words, it's feelings. Your eyes, your face, your vibrations will communicate who you are, what you need, how you're feeling, and everything will be on that subtle level. Such a divine intellect, such a subtle intellect. And I even remember once Baba said something so sweet. He said, when there's a pure heart, a loving heart, it will create a divine intellect. And I really believe that when, sometimes we might feel, well, my intellect's a bit simple, my intellect's a bit this, my intellect's a bit that. But really when there's true love for one, I think, the gift of that is the intellect just becomes cleaner and cleaner and cleaner and more subtle. So the intellect is a really fascinating part of our anatomy, and probably the most influential part, because it's the intellect that receives the data from the mind. The intellect's decisions really create all my sanskaras, and then eventually even the sanskaras start to influence and dominate the intellect. And now the intellect is filled with God's truth, and I'm now freeing myself from my old sanskaras. So I'm not sure when I'm supposed to finish, actually. Oh, okay, we can have some questions. I wasn't sure whether we finish at 12 or 12:30. Okay. So anyway, maybe we can have a couple of minutes of traffic control, because it should emerge in a second. I'm looking at the clock. And then if anyone wants to ask something or make a comment or whatever, you're most welcome. We can have a little bit of time for questions.
शिव पिता को अब याद अपने सुकर्मों के बल पर ही सतयुग में तुमको आना है। शिव पिता को अब याद करो।